So here to talk about how they built a traveling exhibit, balancing the needs of all of these different elements, are Michelle, Abigail, and Kaylee in their talk, Bringing Genetics to You, Evaluation and Discussion of Genetics Content in Museums as it relates to traveling exhibits.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kate. Hello, everybody. My name is Kaylee, and I'm going to start talking a little bit about why we covered genetics in the first place. NCSE has a strong history of climate change and evolution, so genetics may seem like it's diverting from that. However, I'd like to make the argument that, in fact, genetics is a rapidly evolving field, becoming more and more relevant to the average person with every innovation and every discovery. Our project really aims to evaluate that national conversation about genetics, specifically in informal education settings. We also want to distill patterns for how genetics knowledge is distributed, and then we wanted to produce a traveling exhibit educated from our findings. Our project is driven by the motivation to help overcome barriers to genetics education, build a stronger knowledge to action pipeline among the general public. Through our research, we identified three major barriers, the first of which was the perception that genetics is far too difficult to understand, that you have to be so smart and to understand and learn about it. And we really want to turn that notion on its head, demonstrating that it's as easy to keep up with the karyotypes as it is with the Kardashians. And in fact, it's probably more relevant to your life. Second, we want to acknowledge that the education gap only widens the longer that you're out of school. It's likely that the last time any of us actually engaged with genetics content was maybe 7th grade when we were learning about Mendel's peas and doing Punnett squares. Like most things that we learn about in school that we kind of decide are less relevant to our life, things like random dates in history, how the stock market works, or what the mitochondria does, we stop trying to learn and make room in our brains, instead replacing it with things that are more relevant and more valuable to us. However, with this exhibit, what we hope to demonstrate is that genetics is in fact one of those things worth staying educated about, since it is so relevant to your life right now. And it also relates to larger topics, providing a gateway to think conversations about things like evolution. Lastly, we know that we're fighting the pull of social media and Google. For many people, these are the #1 sources of information. However, there have been so many studies that show that information from these sources at its core is met with high levels of doubt and distrust. Instead, places like museums and local community centers and libraries have been able to persevere as beacons of safe and trustworthy knowledge. And we want to leverage those locations to provide captivating genetics content to people who may not otherwise have access. So, when the barriers of mental framing, education gaps, and physical distance are allowed to build up, they really manifest in a population removed from genetics knowledge that would otherwise really help them enact genetics-based decisions that are impacting their lives. So our approach for creating a solution to this problem followed 5 major research questions. The first really wanted to understand, where is genetics physically and how is it being talked about? Once we understood where that was, we were able to understand who was actually being able to access it based on the physical distribution and also the locations and the different types of institutions housing that content. From there, we were able to compare this map with narratives from museums about how they were able to engage with their communities. And then we used those interviews to derive patterns for approaches to how to teach and educate about genetics. From there, we used all of that information to inform our genetics development. To answer each question, we combined information from a broad meta-analysis and the series of interviews that I mentioned to identify strategic approaches for exhibit distribution and content. We then validated our approach by using a front-end assessment distributed to the communities that were hosting the exhibit that we are going to send it to. Our cumulative findings are then represented in a publication, and finally the exhibit itself. So to talk about the first component, the meta-analysis, I'm going to hand you over to Michelle.
Awesome, thank you, Kaylee. And so as Kaylee was mentioning, this really took a several-pronged approach. And the first approach was to understand what was out there and where it was being offered. And so we did this through a large meta-analysis that looked at not only the physical distribution, but also the type of museum offering genetics content. And lastly, identified what we're coining as genetics content deserts. So these areas within the United States that really don't have any access to genetics content in a hands-on museum setting. And so in order to do this, we performed a search that looked at different types of museums across all 50 states that fell under categories that most likely would represent or offer genetics content. And this included history, science, nature, children's museums, medical museums, and then museums coined as multiple, so maybe history and science. This resulted in 604 museums that we included in our study. I then went and visited all 604 websites, and I did keyword searches that used 22 keywords commonly associated with genetics. I also did manual searches through the websites, looking at both exhibit descriptions as well as photos to identify potential genetics content. Less than 15% of the museums have genetics content. And so this showed us that while there was a lot of museums that had the potential to offer genetics content, very little actually did. And from these, it was mostly at science and history museums. And additionally, we found that 8 states didn't offer genetics content at all. But we know that we're not limited by state lines. And so we wanted to see how accessible genetics content truly was. And so to do this, we ran an analysis that looked at a 150-mile radius. And the reason we selected this was we assumed that this was a good radius for a day trip. And so how much of the United States was within a day trip of genetics content? And as you can see here by this heat map, a large portion of the East Coast is heavily populated with genetics content, while the Midwest really had a lot of these genetic deserts or these barren areas where genetics content just really wasn't accessible. But geography alone is not the only barrier that presents itself. And so through the meta-analysis, we found several other observations that showed and suggested barriers. The first one is that of the 201 children's museums included in the study, only 3 offer genetics content. And so this suggests that genetics may be too complicated to present to children. And so this really leads to a misunderstanding that can be carried on into adulthood, that genetics is just too hard to understand. Additionally, we found that sponsorship really directed messaging. And so we saw this in 2 different types of examples. The first is university-affiliated museums tended to promote the research that was happening at the university. And while this is really great for all stakeholders involved, it can also cause barriers that prevent the individual from seeing themselves in the science and how it applies to their everyday lives. Additionally, medically sponsored exhibits tended to focus on health and fitness in the absence of genetics content. And so this can lead to indirect messaging that applies health and fitness and genetics are 2 very different topics that don't intertwine. And so through these observations, we really wanted to gain a greater understanding of what drove the learning goals and outcomes of these genetics exhibits. And so now Abigail's going to talk about some of our museum interviews that led to that greater understanding.
Thank you, Michelle. So after figuring out where these genetics exhibits were through the meta-analysis, our first goal was to understand what was out there with respect to content and how it was being presented. Our second goal was then to identify common themes between museums, so similar content, similar messaging strategies, similar learning goals, and finally analyze how these design choices and messaging strategies impact the narrative of how genetics is presented to visitors. So our methods for our interviews, we conducted 12 semi-structured interviews from 11 museums in the United States and 1 in Canada. So these semi-structured interviews, we're a set of predetermined questions, but then they really allow the curators to kind of talk about what they're interested or what they think is most important in the exhibit. These were all then audio transcribed, and we developed code books looking at motivation for creating the exhibit, the topics in the exhibit, learning goals, physical elements and hooks of the exhibit, and different evaluation methods across museums. And the Rural Museums team will talk more in depth about codebook development in a moment. So after our first codebook development, we then measured our inter-observer error by coding the same interviews between me and Kaylee. And we did this codebook development process 3 times until there was enough concordance in our coding. All right. And so from those code books, we did a k-means clustering analysis, which revealed 3 major approaches to genetics, content, and museums. Our first category is genetics is fun. The second is genetics is relevant. And the third narrative was genetics is discovery. And we'll go into the unique characteristics of each of those categories momentarily. So in genetics is fun, some outstanding characteristics for this group included an emphasis on interactivity in their exhibits. They were very strong in their front-end evaluation. Some of the unique contents that were specific to this group were focused on trait inheritance and genetic tools and technology. And these exhibits were also very volunteer-based. In our second category, genetics is relevant. We characterize this group as kind of having a variety or a smorgasbord of genetics topics that they presented on. Specifically, they really focused on health testing and DNA basics that stood out in this group. A lot of museums in this category also had a traveling component as well. And a subcategory of museums in this group focused on the big idea design behind how they presented their content. In our final group, genetics is discovery. These are really characterized by having a fishbowl style genetics exhibit where their genetics research lab was actually just behind a pane of glass where visitors can see actual scientists working. They were also very big on showcasing their collections in the museum. And they also had visitors participating in research actively in a subset of these museums. So as we looked at all these different design choices and messaging strategies of each group, we wanted to ask how the drivers of the exhibit design produce key elements of the exhibit and how genetics is presented to the visitor. So one of the main themes we saw was this fishbowl narrative of genetics approach of watching scientists work versus museums that actually have participants engage in IRB research, like the Taste Test Lab in Denver. So studies show that visitors really value getting to see real scientists, and the fishbowl labs are a great opportunity to highlight the diversity of staff and combat sometimes damaging perceptions of scientists. While at the same time, there is also value in doing an experiment yourself, which is really good for science self-efficacy and the belief that you contribute to and participate in the culture of science. So another narrative we observed was how gamification was really important to visitors, especially younger audiences, and getting them to engage with the exhibit. We found that museums that were also focused on young audiences and interactivity did more front-end and summative evaluations, so really focusing on what do the visitors want to learn. And then you have museums later in like the relevancy group, which are more focused on what should you be learning, what is applicable to your life. And they presented a lot of their exhibits through personal narratives in their design, which is really important for personal reflection, generating discussion among visitors, and grounding science concepts in ways that are accessible to visitors. And a subset of these museums in the relevancy category also had a really big, were really big on the idea of conceptual coherency, or our big idea design. And that's when there's an underlying abstract theory unifying all the physical pieces of the exhibit. So the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry did this really well through their Genghis Khan exhibit, where they tied different topics of DNA basics, inheritance, genetic ancestry testing, and ethics together, all through the idea of Genghis Khan and his genetic legacy. So there's been a lot of research on the importance of elevating exhibits from just being entertaining to how we can make them more effective teaching tools, and conceptual coherency is one of those main strategies. So after evaluating each of these approaches, we saw that they all have their merits, but we wanted to use the approaches that were the most appropriate for our audience, who may have A, less access to genetics, and B, be more hesitant about engaging with genetics content. So we used our front-end evaluation to better understand our audience, the meta-analysis to understand where they are, and then our research from museum interviews to design an exhibit for them that aims to increase confidence in genetics decision-making. So our traveling exhibit will be going to the following locations in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Waco, Texas, and Iowa City in multiple libraries, which we have confirmed support from. And the support came from our network of fellows like Michelle and Kaylee. And from here on, Kaylee will be talking more about the specific content of our traveling exhibit.
Awesome. Thank you, Abigail. So like we said, we have an amazing network of fellows that we were able to leverage in order to get commitments from our libraries across the country. And we were able to leverage a lot of our front end assessment in order to understand what we should be putting into our exhibit design. So our panels were designed to not only provide genetics information in a really engaging and relatable way, but we also wanted to make really strategic choices about signaling positive mental framing around genetics ideas. So each panel employs 3 main strategies to ensure that we follow this directive. One is the power of narrative. The second is the importance of interactivity. And then the third is wonder and technology, wonder and discovery. So these strategies were derived from our meta-analysis and our interviews, and they also were really considering our unique audience. So one thing to really consider with traditional museums is that they have museum goers going because they have a topic that they're really interested about, right? We've all seen the dinosaur space human body exhibit that draws us to the museum. However, our front end assessment really showed us that people who go to libraries aren't necessarily going because the library has a fun event. The biggest draws for those people are things like checking out a book or using the computer services at the library. And so that means our audience is really stumbling across our panels. And so we have to really create this visual that's engaging and then the narrative that's really compelling for them to stay and read. So this first example are 2 of our panels that are from the first is the ancestry panel, and then the second one is in the athletics content panel. So what I really want to point out here on the left with Janine is it has a really broad, big picture of a person who looks like somebody you might know. It gives you a little bit of background, a name to identify with, and it really starts to hook you with, hey, this is a person that has kind of a cool story that maybe sounds like somebody I know, or maybe even myself, and you kind of start to become hooked and engaging with understanding her journey through the ancestry panel and kind of keep that consistent thread. On the athletics panel on the right-hand side, you see us deviate a little bit from the inherent narrative, which is of a high school student. But one thing that's really awesome that we're able to juxtapose on this panel is you see the picture of our high school students still present, still part of the conversation that's being had, along with some really kind of heavier scientific information. And what we're signaling here is, hey, this is just a high school kid. He can understand it. He's engaging with this material. So can you. We're signaling in this way that a lot of the information that might seem too complex is totally accessible and relevant when you have an interest in it, like our narrative does here. So let's think about interactivity as another component. Here you see slides again from our ancestry, and then on the right you see an iPad representative of our ethics panel where we dive into the ethics surrounding genetics, which is incredibly deep. So on the left with the ancestry panel, you start to see one example of gamification, which is an incredibly strong pattern that we saw from our interviews as a way to engage people with content. From here, we pose a lot of questions to the audience and to the reader and asking them to kind of try to pair, where are these people from? And we'll engage bright lights and buttons that would help people kind of, be touch friendly, but also wipeable down because we know COVID is possibly still a thing. And on the right with the iPad, we have this iPad on every single one of our panels. And one example of a person we've been able to collaborate with is Alta Charo over at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which awesomely is also in one of our genetics deserts. So it helps us kind of push in that direction as well by getting a collaborator from there. But Alta Charo is one of the leading ethicists of the field. So she's a brilliant, bright mind. And yet when you're interacting with her on the iPad, you're effectively asking her, pre-made questions, but you're starting to hear her talk to you in a way that is really understandable and feels like she's engaging with you on your level. And so this is a way to show that scientists are not some crazy ivory tower people. These are people who you can engage with, and the things that they think about and work on are actually very interactable to you. So lastly, in technology, One of the things that we kind of learned was people like to talk about technology as, oh my gosh, this is so cool. You should totally learn about this. This sexy science is so awesome, right? Like we sometimes get really hype about our science. And CRISPR is one of those things, right? It got so much news attention, especially with the Nobel Prize coming out recently. You know, it's so amazing, this awesome new technology. And that can make it kind of seem a little too far flung, right? We can be like, well, it's so cool, but I could never, like, how am I ever going to use that? Like CRISPR is just this thing that exists in the lab, right? Well, through our panel on CRISPR designed by Abigail, you can start to see how a regular father and son have to interact with this idea through hearing loss of the son in this particular story. And so it's making this idea of genetic technology and the process of discovery really relatable and not this big scary thing that only happens in the lab, but instead happens in everyday life. So we want to talk a little bit about how we're going to make all of this happen. So for about 3 months, we spent time collecting data for our interviews and doing the meta-analysis. It was a lot of time, and so I do want to really give props to my team for sticking with it for 3 months of really hard work. From there, we were able to start prepping the manuscript, which is so close to done. We are going through final edits as we speak, which is really exciting that we've been pushing so hard to get something completed by the end of the year, so that by 2021, we have a submitted publication. We've been working kind of consistently on the panel content formulation, both starting with what are the general feel that we want to have? Do we want to have something that's really bright and bubbly, or do we want to have something that's maybe more a nod to traditional lab feel? And we kind of struck a balance with our color choices that you've been seeing throughout this presentation. And then also the narrative and content has been worked and worked and worked to make it the best it possibly can be. We anticipate our exhibit to be finalized with the content and the design in early spring. Also trying to solidify all of our manufacturing and production steps. All of that will be done in the early new year, with the dissemination happening around the May mark, COVID permitting, that we'll be able to get that shipped off to our first location and then around the country to the other 3. And so we really just want to thank you, all the people who have given their time and their input on this, especially the interviewees, for giving us a lot of their really great insights. Thank you to Michelle and Kate for being absolutely wonderful leaders on this. And with that, we'll take questions if we have time.